There are some days that begin like any other, quiet and ordinary, with nothing to suggest that they will later be remembered as the day everything changed. The day a life split into before and after without warning. And for Savannah, that day began just like the rest, with routine, responsibility, and the quiet determination of someone who had already sacrificed more than most people her age. Because at 21, while others were chasing dreams and building futures, she had chosen to stay behind, to pause her own life so she could stand beside her mother during a battle that was slowly taking everything from their family. And in that choice, there was love, deep and unwavering. The kind of love that does not ask questions or seek recognition, only to be present when it matters most. And that was who Savannah was. Someone who showed up, someone who stayed, someone who did not run when life became difficult. Which is why what happened next would feel so impossible to those who knew her. Because nothing about her disappearance would match the person she had always been. Not her actions, not her decisions, not even the final message that was sent from her phone. A message that would later raise more questions than answers. A message that felt wrong in ways her family could not immediately explain but instinctively understood. Because sometimes love allows you to recognize truth even when there is no evidence yet to prove it. And on that day, Savannah left her home wearing her work uniform, just as she always did, heading toward the restaurant where she worked, a place only minutes away, a place that had become part of her routine. Her life moving between shifts and hospital visits, between trays of food and quiet evenings at home. And there was nothing unusual about her leaving that day. Nothing that would make her parents pause or worry. Nothing that would suggest that within minutes of arriving at her destination, everything would go terribly wrong. Because when her car entered the parking lot, it did not signal danger.
Are you
It did
sure
not
about
signal
this?
the beginning of a
Yeah,
tragedy.
it'll be fine.
It was just
I don't know.
another arrival,
Trust me.
another shift about to begin. But what happened after she parked would never be undone. Because somewhere in that space between stepping out of her car and walking into the restaurant, she encountered someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to speak with. And that moment, that brief interaction, would become the last time she was seen freely standing on her own. Because instead of walking inside to begin her shift, she entered another vehicle, and that decision, whether made willingly at first or under pressure that could not be seen on camera, marked the point where control slipped away from her, where her story began to move in a direction no one around her could see. And as minutes passed, no one realized that she had not walked into work. No one realized that something was already unfolding just outside, because life continued as normal inside the restaurant. Orders were taken, food was served, conversations continued, and time moved forward without hesitation. While outside, something far darker was taking place. Something hidden behind closed doors and tinted windows. Something that would only later be understood through fragments of evidence and pieces of truth forced out under pressure. And when Savannah did not arrive for her shift, it was noticed. Because she was not someone who missed work. She was reliable, consistent, someone others depended on. And so, concern began quietly. A call placed to her family. A simple question that quickly turned into confusion. Because she had left home on time. She should have been there. There was no reason for her to be missing. And then came the message, sent from her phone, claiming that she had met someone and decided to leave, to start a new life, to disappear without warning. But the message felt wrong. The tone unfamiliar, the words rushed and careless in a way that did not match her. And more than that, the idea itself did not make sense. Because Savannah was not someone who would walk away from her responsibilities, especially not when her mother was fighting for her life, especially not without saying goodbye. And so doubt settled in quickly, turning concern into fear. And when her family went to the location where she was supposed to be, they found something that made the situation impossible to ignore. Her car, parked just outside the restaurant, close enough to suggest she had arrived. But inside it were all the things she would never leave behind if she had truly chosen to go somewhere. Her wallet, her identification, her belongings, everything except her phone. And there was something else. Something that did not belong. a detail that felt deliberate rather than accidental, a damaged tire, as if someone had made sure the car would not move again. And in that moment, the story shifted from confusion to something far more serious. Because this was no longer about someone choosing to leave. This was about someone being stopped from leaving. And when the police were contacted, the response was not immediate urgency. Not at first. Because in many cases, adults are allowed to leave on their own, and without clear signs of danger, the situation can be treated as less critical in the early hours. But for the family, time did not feel flexible. Time felt urgent. Every minute stretching into fear, every unanswered question growing heavier. And as investigators began looking into the situation, small pieces of information started to surface. Interviews conducted, statements collected, each one adding to a picture that still did not fully make sense, because there were contradictions, inconsistencies, things that did not align. And then came the footage, a wider camera angle that revealed what had been missed before, showing Savannah outside her car, speaking with someone, and then entering his vehicle, a moment that would become the key to everything that followed, because it confirmed that she had not left on her own, not in the way the message suggested. And as investigators looked closer, the situation became even more disturbing, because additional details showed signs of struggle, movements that suggested resistance, a sequence of events that pointed towards something forced rather than voluntary. And when the identity of the man connected to that vehicle was discovered, it added another layer of complexity, because he was not a stranger. He was someone from her workplace, someone who had already been questioned and had not told the truth, someone who had claimed he was not even present that day. And now the evidence was beginning to show otherwise, revealing that he had been there, that he had interacted with her, that he had been the last known person to see her before she disappeared. And suddenly, the focus of the investigation narrowed, turning toward him, toward his statements, toward the inconsistencies that were becoming impossible to ignore. And as pressure increased, so did the need for answers. Because somewhere between the parking lot and the silence that followed, something had happened that could not be undone. Something that had taken a life that was built on kindness, responsibility, and sacrifice, and transformed it into a case that would soon demand truth, justice, and accountability, even if that truth would be painful to uncover, even if it would confirm the worst fears that had already begun to take shape in the minds of those who loved her. Because sometimes the hardest part is not just losing someone, but understanding how it happened, how a normal day can turn into something irreversible, how trust can become danger, and how a single moment can change everything forever. As investigators focused their attention on the man connected to the vehicle, the case began to move away from uncertainty and toward a direction that felt increasingly heavy with truth, because the more they examined his statements, the more they found gaps that could not be ignored, small details that did not align, timelines that shifted slightly each time he spoke, and explanations that felt constructed rather than remembered, as if he was trying to stay ahead of something he feared would eventually surface. And when he was brought in again for questioning, the tone of the conversation changed. No longer casual, no longer exploratory, but deliberate, precise, and persistent. Because by that point, investigators already knew more than they were revealing, and they were waiting, watching, giving him the space to speak while carefully measuring every word he offered. And at first, he continued with the version of events he had prepared, claiming that he had only met Savannah briefly, that their interaction had been limited, that whatever happened afterward had nothing to do with him. But the more he spoke, the more the cracks began to show, because maintaining a false story requires consistency, and consistency becomes harder to control when pressure builds, especially when the truth is sitting just beneath the surface, waiting to break through. And as the questioning continued, investigators began to introduce pieces of evidence in subtle ways, not all at once, but gradually, forcing him to adjust, to rethink, to shift his narrative. And each adjustment brought him closer to contradiction, closer to the point where denial could no longer hold. And eventually, he changed his story, admitting that he had seen her that day, that they had spoken, that she had entered his vehicle, but even then, he attempted to minimize what had happened, framing it as a simple conversation that ended without incident, claiming that she had left afterward, that someone else had picked her up, introducing a new character into the story, a vague figure with no clear identity, a convenient explanation meant to redirect suspicion. But by that time, investigators already had evidence that directly challenged that claim, evidence that showed she had not left his vehicle, evidence that placed him at the center of the last known moments of her life. And when confronted with these contradictions, the pressure intensified, the room growing heavier with each unanswered question, each pause stretching longer, each silence becoming more difficult to maintain. And it was in those moments that the truth began to surface. Not all at once, but in fragments, in partial admissions, in statements that revealed more than they were meant to, until finally the reality of what had happened could no longer be hidden behind shifting stories and incomplete explanations, because he admitted that something had gone wrong inside the vehicle, that an argument had escalated, that control had been lost, and that in that moment of chaos, he had made a choice that would take a life and destroy many others in the process. And though he attempted to frame it as something accidental, something that happened in the heat of the moment, the outcome remained the same, because Savannah did not leave that car alive. And from that point forward, every action he took was not about resolution but concealment, an attempt to erase what had happened, to remove evidence, to create distance between himself and the truth. But those actions only deepened the severity of the situation, because they showed intent, awareness, and a willingness to hide rather than take responsibility. And when he finally revealed where her body had been left, investigators moved quickly, knowing that even in the worst-case scenario, her family deserved answers, deserved the chance to bring her home. And when they arrived at the location, a quiet, isolated area that gave no indication of what it held beneath the surface, they began the search, a process that was both methodical and emotional, because every step carried the weight of confirmation, the weight of knowing that they were no longer searching for someone to rescue, but for someone to recover. And when they found her, the reality of the situation became undeniable. The loss complete, the outcome final. And though the exact details of her final moments could never be fully reconstructed, what remained was the truth that her life had been taken in a moment that should never have happened, a moment born from anger, control, and a complete disregard for the value of another human being. And as the investigation concluded, the focus shifted toward accountability, toward ensuring that the person responsible would face the consequences of his actions. And while the legal process moved forward, with charges filed, court proceedings held, and eventually a conviction reached, none of it could restore what had been lost. None of it could return the life that had been taken or heal the pain left behind, because for Savannah's family, the outcome was not about punishment alone. It was about understanding, about facing a reality that no parent should ever have to face, the loss of a child in a way that feels both sudden and deeply unjust. And as time passed, the story did not fade into memory, because stories like this do not disappear. They remain as reminders, as lessons, as reflections of how quickly life can change and how important it is to recognize the signs that something is wrong, to trust instincts when something feels off, to act when silence or inconsistency appears where it should not. And while nothing could change what happened, there is meaning in awareness, in understanding, in sharing these stories not to create fear, but to encourage attention, to remind others that safety is not always obvious, that danger does not always come from strangers, and that sometimes the most important moments are the ones that seem ordinary at first, because those are the moments where decisions are made, where paths are chosen, where lives can shift without warning. And in remembering Savannah, what remains most important is not just how her story ended, but how she lived, with strength, with compassion, with a willingness to put others before herself. And that is the part of her story that should never be overshadowed. Because even in the face of tragedy, the truth of who she was still matters. still deserves to be remembered and still stands as a reminder that every life holds value, every moment holds meaning, and every story, no matter how it ends, deserves to be told with honesty, respect, and care.